Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
How you doing?
Oh, just limping to the end of the year.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It
May is
also,
short and sweet.
it was like sunny and beautiful in New York, and now it's just like raining again, and I feel deprived. So let's hope for a sunny summer so that everyone can listen to me be in a good mood and not in a bad mood.
Well, for listeners who are looking for a little sun or shade, we have an answer for you.
Oh my
It's
God. That was quite a way in.
our
Okay.
transition. You like that? Before we start our podcast, we have to remind people about our membership, which is the most exciting thing that has launched at Less Awkward in the last few weeks. So anyone can become a member of our Less Awkward community. And when you become a member, Vanessa, will you tell them what they get?
Behind door number 3 is a searchable library of everything we have ever done: podcasts, newsletters, video clips, an AI bot that answers your questions in our voices based on all the content we've ever written, spoken, any of it, workshops. So we have a workshop, a pre-summer workshop about preparing kids for summer independence, which will relate to an episode we have coming up with Emily Edlin about autonomy supportive parenting. You'll hear more about that. And our weekly newsletter, which, because Cara can't help herself, is a deep dive into every subject. And
5,000 words. No, it's not 5,000 words,
it's,
but it's a
not
good,
quite
juicy read.
5,000 words. Yes. So if that is the content you love getting from us, join our membership, because we make it all less awkward. And to that end, Cara.
Well, I mean, because if you listen to this episode, that is the answer to a great listener question: to spy or not to spy. That is the question. And let's say you listen to this episode and we gave a piece of advice or we told a story that really stuck with you, but didn't stick enough to remember exactly. And you want to go back, but you don't have time to re-listen. You know what you can do? You can go onto our awkward bot and you can type in to spy or not to spy, or the question that you have, or a related thought, and you will get a summarized answer with the information from this podcast. So exciting. So let's get into it, Vanessa. To spy or not to spy? This is the question we got this week. A listener wrote in and said, okay, I want to know, I'm paraphrasing. I want to know, number one, should I spy on my kid or not? And number two, if I do spy and I find something inappropriate. So the spying context here was on devices, right? Look at what your kids are doing on their screens. If I spy and I do find something inappropriate, what do I do with this information, right? And the follow-up question they asked, which was so wonderful, and this I'm going to read verbatim: how can I have an honest conversation with my child without them completely hating me for reading their text messages? All right, Vanessa, you want to get started?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. And interestingly, we have been in several rooms in the last month where this question has come up. So we were interviewed at a massive benefit on stage, and the person interviewing us asked this literal question. And when we gave our answer, she had some other feelings about it. So that was super interesting. Then I was in a room with a bunch of pediatricians and psychologists, and the question came up there, and they had a series of answers. And then it comes up all the time with our peers who are super curious about what their kids are doing. So it's in the air. There's something about, I don't know, May that makes people really interested
Wonder
in
if they
whether they should
have to spy on their kids. You know, Vanessa, though, it's also, it's an evergreen question, right? It's a question that people have been asking forever. Should I be reading my kid's diary?
Right. So that came up in one of the places, which it turned out someone had been reading their kid's diary also, and then claimed that their kid didn't know. And the rest of us in the room were like, they always know. They always find out.
The other 300 people in the room were all looking at the person who was speaking,
Yeah.
telling this story. And yes, that was
So
the
it
through
is an
line.
evergreen question. The use of technology by everybody in a household makes it a more complicated question because there are various ways to find out information about your kids, look in on their social interactions online, see what else they may be posting or filming or writing, tracking them or not tracking them, using things like Ring cameras to
Or
look,
Life 360.
or Life 360 to see what they're doing. I mean, sometimes when I really want to scare the crap out of my family, when I get the alert on my phone that someone is at the front door on the Ring camera, and it turns out it's one of my family members, like going to walk the dog or I don't know, getting a package, I'll start talking to them through the Ring camera, and I always get the same reaction, which is not pleased. The
It's just a
first
subtle reminder that there are cameras everywhere.
There's just a subtle reminder that I'm always watching. So the first thing is, I think we should lay down some like baseline philosophical principles, and then we can get into some of the nitty gritty and some of the follow on questions that this listener asked. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you have thought out what your baseline philosophy is. If you want to start with yours.
Yeah. I mean, in the world of pediatrics, and I would venture to guess in the world of psychology as well, although I don't live in that world. So, psychologists, please let me know if this is correct. But in the world of pediatrics, there's a pretty strong feeling that spying and obtaining information without the knowledge of your kids lands you in a really tricky spot. It doesn't mean you should never do it. And there are circumstances, especially when it comes to safety, where adults, particularly parents or guardians, feel the absolute need and are encouraged by some professional or another to spy, to get information that their kids are not disclosing that will then help keep that kid safe. So I want to put those circumstances aside. So I want to take out of this conversation a child, for instance, who is showing some signs of depression, and there are a few things that are worrying, and the adult in the house doesn't know what to do with this information. And it has been recommended to them that they gather more information about that kid, because that's a whole different conversation. And we could go down a deep rabbit hole on that one. And I don't think that's relevant to this question, which is sort of more of a generalist question, right? And there aren't health and safety implications. And I don't want you to think, by the way, that I think just if you're worried about mental health, that it's an automatic pass to spy. But I do think there is a rationale that is often given for collecting information about a kid you're worried about goes into a different category.
Right. I mean, if you're concerned about substance abuse or substance use disorder or things they may be keeping in their bedrooms that are dangerous for other members of the house, and maybe they've assured you those items are not in their room, and then it turns out actually those items are in their room, and A, they shouldn't be using them, but B, they're accessible to younger siblings or pets or things like that. So
Right.
I think
So there's
the
this
health and
bucket.
safety bucket. And frankly, that health and safety bucket assumes, I think, that we've gone down the path of what we're about to talk about, which are some of the foundational approaches and conversations we would have already have had with the
Yes.
kids in our
So
house.
so let's do that, because this is where most pediatricians would land. Most of us will say, short the safety piece, if you spy and that's how you collect your information, number one, you have violated your kid's trust. And if the information comes out in the context of, well, yes, I got it without you granting me permission or access, that's a fundamental violation. It shifts the dynamic in the relationship. It throws up a hurdle. And, we need to look no further back in our own life journeys than the adult or older kid. Maybe it's a sibling, maybe it's a younger kid who traipsed into our room or our space when we were growing up and violated our privacy, and that memory floods right back. So, there's that piece. And then the other problem with spying is if you don't want to disclose that you have done something without the knowledge and permission of the kid, then what do you do with the information? Right. So I've had so many parents over the years ask me questions like, should I drug test my kid without their knowledge? Which, I mean, it's not super easy, but it's doable. But then what do you do with the information? Okay, you get a positive drug test. Now you have to explain that you covertly tried to gather this information. You have missed the boat on the opportunity to have all of those conversations. Granted, they are very hard conversations, but you've missed the boat on the opportunity to have the conversations that then prepare everyone involved for a possible outcome in any direction, right?
Yeah. So I think there's the covert behavior that is sort of non-technology related. And then there's the modern conundrum of technology related snooping, spying. We've heard all different words in the last few weeks. And I want to talk about that for a second because it goes back to what are the stepping stones we put down when we give our kids access to technology? What are the conversations we have? What is the planning we do? What are the contracts we agree to? And then we can talk about how do we handle, do we snoop or not, and how do we deal with the information we have? So in my house, when my kids got phones, we made it clear it was a privilege, not a right, and that we had permission to check what was on their phones, to spot check if they were going to be on social media, that we had permission to follow them. Now, there's a lot of ways kids can go around those things, and we can talk about that. This is not foolproof. Also, when my kids were first starting to do things like be in group chats, I would sort of look over their shoulder and see what they were saying with permission, fully with their knowledge. I don't get their feeds on my computer. I know some people who do and who, can see, particularly with younger kids, the stuff coming in, but their kids know about it and have permission. Again, that's usually younger kids. Most recently, I don't really spot check my kids, certainly not my older kids. Do I think that they've done and said and done all sorts of stuff that I would not be thrilled about? Yes, I'm sure they have. So part of this is a bandwidth issue. Like you can create parameters and expectations and rights with respect to your relationship to your kids and their technology. And then there's the follow through and the consequences. And there's all sorts of apps and things like that where you can oversee what's being written and said on your kids' devices. I will fully admit that there's a point where I just run out of time and energy to do all of this.
I'm laughing because it is not because she has 4 children that she has no bandwidth. You could have one child and not have the bandwidth to do all this. Just saying.
Yeah, I mean, and some people are like really committed to it, and that's fine. But these are all circumstances where kids know and are aware that the content on their devices is being checked. I know people who check their kids' search histories, right? Because they're interested to see what they're Googling, what they're searching. All of that is with the knowledge. And each family will choose to do that differently. They will choose what they have the energy for, where they set up the parameters. But this is upfront expectations and clarity on what is being looked at.
Right. So I want to parse the language you used. This is very important language. You used the word permission and you used the word knowledge. And what I heard and what I know to be true about you is you have open conversations about this kind of stuff with your kids. So when you say it's not without permission, what you mean by that is, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, this is not without having had a conversation with my kid that we are going to do it this way. You're not asking your kids permission for you to check. What you're saying is, this is the bargain that we're striking when I choose to give you this thing. And we're going to be in conversation about it. And I'm going to let you know when it's time for me to check, because this is the deal that we are signing.
Right. And like they can easily like clear a chat if they know I'm going to check. And, to the point where, and this is, listen, I'm not claiming to be perfect, to the point where, one of my kids charges his phone in my office and puts it there every night. And I could easily open it up and scroll through or look at what the chats are on the lock screen when it's charging. And I don't do that.
But I'm gonna do a big but here.
Right. But lots of parents do and have the right and their kids know that they do that.
And it really depends on how old your kid is and who your kid is. So, the goal is to launch kids who are independent beings who can manage all of these responsibilities. And this, your private thoughts and your private ideas and your communication, whether it's by diary and handwritten letter or on a text thread and social media, those have always been things that kids have had ownership of, and that they also have to learn to manage. This is the learning curve of being a kid. And
right.
So if we're talking about a 10-year-old who has a device, and look, side note, it would be wonderful if 10-year-olds did not have devices that they called their own. But reality check, 10-year-olds are on devices at school and at home in order to do schoolwork. So the devices are in their lives, whether we want that or not. And the question is how many and what the ownership is and all that. But if we're talking about a 10-year-old versus a 16-year-old, of course, these conversations look different. The permissions look different. All of it. And I think we're implying that in the conversation, but it bears stating really clearly, because spying is spying. So, what I did when my kids got phones, and my kids, they're my kids. So poor things, they didn't get phones until, this 7th grade, and that was my choice. And frankly, the wait until 8th movement is very compelling. And if my kids were close to that, I would probably be in conversation about doing that. But that is me. That is not everyone else. But when my kids did get their phones, the way we set it up initially, so they got smartphones that had nothing on them. They were like fully unloaded, basically. The deal was that we would sit down and look at what they were doing on their devices. And we had this thing called Circle in our house, which for those of you who don't know, it sits next to your Wi-Fi router, and it basically picks up and screens the content on every device in the house. So it wasn't just that my kids' content was being flagged in case there was something worrisome, but and it wasn't, and it was documenting that, but their friends' devices were being picked up. And I have to say, that was a little bit of a conundrum for me, because I'm the parent for my kids. It was none of my business what was happening on other kids' phones, and I did not want to be responsible for that information. So there was a layer there that was a little complicated for me.
Yeah. I mean, with my older kids, so that's the younger kids, like, hey, I'm going to check it out. Or Cara, in your case, it was, hey, just so you know, like everything on your phones is coming up on Circle.
Yeah.
As they get older, I believe they have a greater right to privacy.
I totally agree.
To the point where if my kid is sitting next to me on the couch and they're scrolling through text or, Instagram or Snapchat or whatever, I don't peer over their shoulder and look at what they're doing. And the temptation is very great. But I'll say, do you mind if I look at what's on your feed? I'm super curious, but I won't I won't spy, even though I'm sitting right there and they're doing it in front of me. So theoretically, some people would probably say that's not spying, because it's sort of like this, Cara. When my kids were little, they walked into my bedroom without knocking, and I walked into their bedrooms without knocking. And then as they got older, I, as we talk about on many, many podcast episodes, you have to knock. Like there's a stage where your kids, you have to knock. A, so you don't walk in on them naked and they don't necessarily want you to see naked. B, so you don't walk in on them like masturbating or something else. But also C, it's the principle of privacy. Like you want them to be able to begin to learn the lines between private and public. And that has layers and layers and layers of reality in home and out of home. So now I always knock on my kids' doors, except my kids don't always knock on my door. And recently I found myself having to say to them, hey guys, have you noticed that I always knock when I come into your room? Because I think that's a really important value. And I want to show you that I'm respecting your privacy. I would really appreciate it if you reciprocate that and you knock before you come into my room. And I am trying to employ that principle in my house with my kids with respect to all sorts of kinds of privacy, including phone, text, all of that stuff.
That's beautiful. And I agree. The reason I don't lean over and look at my kid's screen is I am undone when people lean over and look at my screen.
Same principle.
It drives me. No, it's not even about my privacy. It just drives me crazy. I find it just weirdly voyeuristic. Have you ever been at the grocery store and checkout line or whatever, and you're quickly on your phone and you feel the person who's next to you trying to see your screen? Like,
no, is that like an LA thing?
I don't know, but I find there's this blurred personal space line that exists that I like my personal space. So I actually have stopped constantly checking my phone and places like that, not because I've become a I'm not a conspiracy theorist and I don't think everyone's trying to read my text, but really because I realize, frankly, that it's so antisocial to be doing it in the first place, right? But in the second place, when I'm engaging with the content on my screen, it's just me and my screen, right? And I feel like for my kids, I would like to show them that same respect, but they are older now, and there is this gradient of privacy. There's a gradient of when it's spying and when it's not. And I think the underlying principle, and you just said it, has to do with being in conversation with your kids and having the rules set out clearly in front of them so that they know what the expectations are. So spying is only spying when the expectation is this is private, and then someone else goes and reads it or watches it or whatever, fill in the verb. Spying is not spying when the conversation has been had and the expectation has been set that, hey, this is shared, right? And as kids get older, they not only can, but should push back and demand a little bit of independence. And you mentioned in the opening, this podcast episode we have coming up with Emily Adlin, and it is about raising autonomous kids, which is not independent. It's a multifactorial concept that really is the ability to behave both independently and very thoughtfully about the people around you, to have sort of respect for those around you, but also to be able to care for yourself. How are we going to raise kids who are autonomous if we don't allow them to say, hey, this is my private space. This is my private stuff. These are my private thoughts. And I want to keep them to myself. And I'd like you to ask before you engage. And again, huge asterisk, when safety is a question, this conversation does not apply.
Right. But there is a very, very large gray area about safety, which is like you're concerned about the tenor of a friendship that your kid has, and you're worried that the exchanges online are harmful, maybe even bullying, or you're worried that your kid is in a relationship and you're not thrilled about the dynamic between them and the person they're romantically involved in, or they're in a group chat and you are really worried about the comments that are getting thrown around. Are they racist or homophobic? And your kid is a sort of a passive participant in those things, right? There are all sorts
But
of things that are
none of those examples are examples where you can't go into them first and say, I'm worried about
right.
this. And in order to kind of soothe me and to placate me, I want to just look at what the conversation is.
And that's the point. That's the sticking point for parents is that's the conversation you have to have. And having that conversation is really hard because you have to address the really tricky nature of a friendship, or you have to address concerns about a romantic relationship, or you have to address the culture of a friend group, right? Like those are really hard conversations to have. And I think the reason people snoop is because to have that conversation feels sometimes almost impossible. And it
Especially when you have a
feels
kid who shuts the door or walks out
a kid who
and
shuts
won't
the
engage.
door, who explodes in anger, who shuts down, who punishes you with silence, right? There's any number of ways that kids block out an attempt at that conversation.
And what's so interesting is the story that you referenced at the top of this episode was a conversation that we had on stage, and it had two elements that were really important. So one was the kid was not openly communicative, and the other was the conversation was too hard for this parent. And by what you did on that stage was so beautiful because you divided and you conquered. And you basically acknowledged that having a non-communicative kid is really hard. And this represents a different type of hurdle that stands in the way of these conversations. And you have to figure that out, and you have to find a way to communicate that works for both of you. To the point, though, when this parent was insistent that the best way through was just spying because it was just easier. It was just you didn't
I don't
the
remember
hook.
what I said. I
Oh my God,
literally
you were so good because you were so, you know what you were? You were so non-judgmental because it is easier not to have this conversation. And yet you just kept going back to, I know. And this isn't the best way through in the long run. Just spying. And the conversation there was not about a text thread and bullying. It was about sexual content. And that's a tricky topic for a lot of people to begin with. And you just kept saying in such an empathic way, I hear you. But if what you do is spy and you don't engage in the conversation at all, then what? And so to the listeners who need an answer to then what? You've spied, you've read the diary, you went and looked at the text, someone forwarded you something, whatever it is, right? The answer is take the do-over, right? It just because you acquired the information in a way that maybe you weren't so proud of or wasn't as effective as you thought doesn't mean that you can't try to acquire the information in a different way as well. So start engaging in conversation. The catch is for some number of you, your kid will call you out. I know you read my diary. I know you went into my phone. And there you're stuck with the conundrum, another pediatric piece of advice, where when prompted to answer, did you or didn't you? If you lie and your kid catches you in a lie, you have lost their trust.
Yeah.
So you should think long and hard about if you did read their diary or go onto their phone and look at a text thread and they ask you point blank, if you say, no, I didn't, then what you have said to your kid when they find you out is, I lie to you and I expect for you to lie to me. And so the advice there is always do not lie. Always, always, always.
I actually have an example, which we were just talking about the other night in my house, where a friend called me, this is now many years ago, and told me a piece of information about one of my kids. And by the way, this was not a horrific, they did something awful and I should be ashamed. It was just, a middle school piece of information. And they said, can you please not tell them that the information came from me because, we have a really nice relationship and I don't want to mess that up, but I really thought you'd want to know. So I said, thank you. So how did I handle it? And this is actually apropos of people who are trying to back out of some spying and trying to engage in the conversation, as you suggest, Cara. I sort of went to the general. So I went to the like, hey, you know what? I realize we have never talked about this, but when you're in this circumstance, I just want to make sure you keep these three things in mind because I knew in this case, he had not kept those things in mind. And that was my fault because I'd never had the conversation with him. And I assumed a level of knowledge and maturity he didn't yet have. And so we had a great conversation about this particular topic. And I didn't ask him anything specific about his behavior. I didn't dive deeper into any of the details that I knew from this other parent. I just generally raised it based in kind of our family's values around certain kinds of behavior, and that was it. Now, he didn't ask me if someone had told me about something he had been doing because I kept it really quite general. And Cara, it's funny, I didn't know you then, but I wonder what I would have said if put in the between the rock and a hard place of promising someone I would keep them confidential versus telling my kid that I had been told this information.
This comes up a lot. And I think the way through is the easiest way through is exactly what you did. Because as soon as you disclose to a kid who your source is, that is yet another person around whom they have to shut down. That's right. And usually the person who is sharing with you something that your kid did is someone who really cares about you and your kid. They're willing to share with you. And so throwing that person under the bus to your kid does you no favors. I mean, it doesn't mean you won't. Some circumstances just require that you disclose that source or the kid guesses it based upon the information. Yeah. But I actually think, the way you navigated that is a great way through. It's a general sort of, there's no reason to point to the source, and you let the source off the hook, and you saved face for your own kid at the same time.
Right. And it relates to the advice we give all the time, which is if you're wondering if your kid is up to something, a particular activity, rather than staring them in the face and saying, are you doing this? Are you watching this? Are you engaging in this behavior? You say, I am wondering, because when I was your age, this was a thing. I'm wondering if it's still a thing. Are kids in your school or your friend group or your camp or whatever, are people still doing that, or is that not a thing anymore? Right. And sort of like general curiosity, interest without a sort of interrogatory, an interrogation, is that a word, interrogatory?
I don't know. I'm just going to let you go. Without interrogating them?
Without interrogating them, yes.
Or you could do the Marsha Brady path through, right? I have a friend who. So you ask it as a question. Do you have any friends who? And it's just an easy out. They know. They know what
and the
we're
only
asking.
problem with that format is that they're worried that the follow-up question is which friend, and they don't want to give that friend up. So I try to keep it.
You want to shake them and be like, "It's about you, dummy."
Yeah,
it's not about your friend.
It's not about your friend. I don't care about your friend. So generally, our answer is between to spy or not to spy. Not to spy.
Don't spy.
If you have done that, you know us. We are not judging you. We understand that your curiosity or worry or some combination of the two has put you in a situation where you feel powerless. And this feels like a way to get some information and some control. We would encourage you to not continue along that path in the future. Again, health and safety and real concerns about mental health, physical safety.
Right. Different
story. With respect to what do you do if you have spied and now you're sitting with this information, our advice is try to be in conversation with your kid and see if you can't gather some information in another way that doesn't involve the spying. And ideally, you are in conversation, setting up expectations, making it clear what kids' rights and privileges are or aren't in your household. And so this doesn't come as a backdoor situation, but really you're having open dialogue as much as you possibly can.
And if they never fess up, if you spied and you found something and they never own up, they never share, you have a choice. How important is it to you to double down on what you know to be true and what you found, or to let it go and to find a different way through next time? And I think that choice ultimately comes down to health and safety. I think if it's something that triggers worry for you about that kid, you don't let it go. And you do fess up and you do say, you know what? I found your diary. You know what? I went on your phone. And you own it, and you can always apologize for it, but you can let them know that the reason that you have landed here is because something in you was worried, and you, as the person who loved them, felt like you needed to look out for them. If you don't do that and don't own it, and you choose to let it go, that's okay too, so long as it's a trivial thing that that's not hanging over your head like a dark cloud. And you'll know pretty quickly, because if you let it go and it keeps circling back for you, then you're going to revisit it.
And try to avoid situations where you set your kid up to lie in response to your question.
Like, did you brush your teeth?
I was just about to say that.
Did you brush your teeth?
Because
yes.
the answer is always yes, and it's a lie. And so try to avoid that line of questioning. Try to find another way, like the way I do it now after 21 years of parenting is, hey, if you haven't yet brushed your teeth, can you go take care of that and then come give me a kiss goodnight? Because then I have the answer to my question without having to ask it. We were talking about this at some point. I used to go so far as to wet my toothbrush so that when my mom went to check if I brushed my teeth.
When your mom was spying?
When my mom was basically, but like, fair enough, I was also like a total liar about brushing my teeth, and I had terrible teeth. So don't set them up to lie. Try to ask questions in a way or approach them in situations where they don't feel like they need to lie. And the last thing I will say, Cara, is sometimes people spy because they want to know how their kids feel about them. Sometimes they find hurtful comments about them while in the process of spying.
You know what they usually don't find?
Really wonderful, loving comments about
a love letter, a secret love letter to my mom.
Unless your kid knows you're spying, and then that's when they write the secret love letter. So for those parents who are concerned about how their kid feels about them or have stumbled on some really unkind stuff, these are children. They have strong, enormous feelings about every human being they come in contact with. Normally, those opinions either are that someone is weird or annoying. But when it comes to you, they probably have a more nuanced vocabulary, which is that you suck and maybe they hate you and you're such a bitch or whatever it is. Just remember they are children and that their feelings and thoughts and opinions will change. And if you rely on spying to find out how connected your kid is to you, that is not going to end well. If you want to feel more connected to your kid, go back to the beginning, find opportunities to do things together, to be in conversation, to not be in conversation, but to do fun, silly things together, and do not use their private places as a way to figure out how your kid feels about you.
Once again, Vanessa, it's a pleasure.
Thank you to this listener for an awesome question. And you even titled your own episode. I mean, how great is that?
Thank you for saving us that work. Any other listeners who have questions and good titles, please email us. Vanessa, what's the email address?
I was just going to say podcast@lessawkward.com, which is how this question came in. podcast@lessawkward.com. Thanks, Cara.
Bye, Vanessa.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.